Okay, folks. So we are going to go ahead and get started with our event today. Sorry, just grabbing my agenda. So, welcome environmental advocates to our General Assembly 101 training. It is the first stop on our trail guide to the General Assembly. As an explainer, as VCN and our network partners gear up to take action during the General Assembly and whatnot, we have worked together to create a, as we're calling it, trail guide that's going to help build advocacy and provide education to environmental advocates all around the Commonwealth. Today's event itself, GEA 101 or General Assembly 101, is meant to demystify the processes around the General Assembly or GA. So y'all as environmental advocates can take action during the General Assembly, either for the first time or with a better understanding of how to adequately apply your time and effort. As a reminder, you might have heard this event is recorded, and this event is in presentation mode. So what that means is you should see something called a Q&A section, which is similar to a chat that you could dump your questions into, and our educators will be able to answer those questions as they come up. Today, our guest speaker is Trias Lockwood. She is with the governor's office and she's one of their senior policy advisors. Our guest educators are Tim Sawinski, and he is with the Sierra Club, and he's one of their communication coordinators, or honestly, the communication coordinator. Wyatt Gordon, he is with us. He's with VCN. He is our land use and transportation policy campaigns manager. And without further ado, more bombast, I'm going to pass it to Trias Lockwood. Trias?
Sure. Thank you, Kyle, and thank you to the VCN team for having me here today. I really appreciate having a few minutes to talk to you all, and thank you to everyone that's joined and for your interest on these important issues. It's so valuable to the Commonwealth and the community, so thank you. So my name is Trias Lockwood, and I'm Senior Policy Advisor to Governor Northam. I have the Natural Resources and Commerce and Trade portfolios. I work with our secretaries and agencies on bills related to those subject areas. So I know I've worked with a lot of you in the past, and thank you for that too. So I'll just spend a few minutes here talking about the importance of advocacy at the General Assembly, and then I'll also touch on the executive branch as well. So when we have these issue areas, right, a lot of times you all have good ideas on legislation, or VCN does, and what you want to do is really cultivate those ideas, and if they make sense for policy, then you can work on those and move those forward with a coalition if possible, right? So I'll just start from summertime, okay? So it's really great when you can work on these issues throughout the year with a coalition. I'll just do ideal scenarios with a coalition, with legislators, with government, if that's helpful too. And so you can start in the summer, have those meetings, right, around a specific issue area. You can start with legislators that represent you, for example. That's always a good place to start because they definitely are interested in hearing from constituents, probably first and foremost. And then you can look at the committees that your legislation, if you're working on a bill, might go through. So for our purposes, likely natural resources or commerce and trade. So you look at those committees and you think about the legislators that make sense to talk to. I always like the approach of talking to everyone on legislation because you never really, unless you talk to the legislator, you really don't know for sure where they stand. So if you have a piece that you're either proposing with the legislator or supporting or opposing, then you want to go through and look at the committee and set up those meetings and talk to them as soon as you can. So yes, most of the work happens during session, but I mentioned the summer because that's a slower time for us, and it's a good time to have those meetings leading up to session. Sometimes you might not know what's coming, and obviously then you address what you have before you. But if you do, or if you have ideas, the summer leading and fall are the best times to really start having those conversations. So you want to really make sure that you talk to legislators, let them know where you are on an issue. And, often this hypothetical is you're supportive and wanting to see something move forward, but also if you have concerns, right? And they want to hear from you. So information on the bill is always helpful. A fact sheet, I like one pagers, and a few points to be able to explain why you support it or what the issue might be with it. So you have these conversations, they're really important. You lead up to session, and then you're there. And it's very fast paced. So you want to make sure by then the committee knows your issue and what your position is on it, and that if appropriate, and if you want to, you testify before committee and really make that position clear. And then as the bills move, you follow them. So if it's a Senate bill first, right, you start there. It passes, you talk to the full Senate if you can, or certain members there strategically, and then you go to the House side. And so another piece of advice is so other than talking to legislators, we're starting early, talking to legislators, really following the process as much as you can. You really want to make sure that you don't lose track of the bill, that you know when it's docketed. And this is hard work, but you just have to really just constantly be online looking at your bills or talking to VCN or other partners to make sure that you're on track and follow it so you don't miss a step. It does happen and you can make up for that, but ideally you follow it the whole way through. Everyone knows your position, they understand why, and you can ideally see some wins at the end of it. So, and then I'll just briefly touch on, I only have another minute here, but I'll briefly touch on the executive branch. So if helpful, consider talking to agencies about the issue area, especially if it relates directly to an agency, and secretaries in the governor's office. So there's many different levels of advocacy that you can engage in. At the end of the day, the governor's office supports, opposes, or has no position on legislation because we take an action on every bill that comes through, right? We sign or veto it or amend it. So if you are supportive, feel free to let your government officials know, or if there's an issue with it, same, because that's always helpful to hear from stakeholders as well. And then when we talk to legislators, we kind of know where stakeholders are on an issue area. So that's my advice. And thank you again for your willingness to engage on these issues, and let's keep up the good work. And I'll hand it back to Kyle.
Thank you, Trace. Awesome. And thank you for volunteering your time today. With up next, I'm going to pass it to Tim, who's going to give us a overview of the GA.
Thank you, Kyle. Always wonderful to follow a policy expert for the governor's administration. So I will try to do my best to be as as great as I can be, just because I'm in the presence of everyone who's so fantastic here. So as Kyle mentioned, Tim Sawinski, I am the communications manager now for the Sierra Club Virginia chapter. I've been recently got a title bump. So I have been working either inside or greatly involved in the General Assembly for about 6 years. And when I first started, I got a lobbying gig 2 weeks before the General Assembly session started. And I thought, well, I have a degree in political science. How hard could it be? It was very hard. I actually didn't know what I was doing the entire time. It was a bit of a crash course in reality of, we can study these things in the abstract, but being involved in it really opened my eyes to the nuances of what goes on in the lawmaking process in Virginia. So from then, I developed a bit of a quick kind of grassroots advocacy guide to help people who are either newcomers to advocacy, especially grassroots advocacy during the state legislative session, or just want to have a little bit more idea about what goes on. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen as soon as I can. There it is. Pull it up. Thank you for your patience. And this is just a little bit of a Cliff Notes. It's a bit of a Cliff Notes version of the larger advocacy training and grassroots guidance that I provide to different groups around the Commonwealth. So I'll go ahead and get started. A lot of this is going to touch on what the last speaker just mentioned, but I want to go into a little bit more depth and talk about it, as well as tell some stories about success stories that I've seen that really do make an impact, not from people who are paid lobbyists, but from advocates like everybody on this call. So first off, quick overview, things I'm going to touch on really quickly. Build a law process, a little bit of Schoolhouse Rock-esque kind of education on it. So I apologize if people are already familiar with this, but it is helpful to provide the whole context. Nuances of lawmaking procedures, again, let's get beyond the surface level and talk about what goes on a little bit on the inside track. And tracking legislation. I have a few examples that I think will be helpful for folks who are really interested in following along with the progress of a particular bill. Quickly, two of the biggest things that you can do and the most impactful things you can do are engaging committees and lobbying our legislators. So we'll just dive right in. Quickly, just an overview of the General Assembly session. 2 chambers, House, Senate. Altogether, it makes 140 members. Sorry about this doesn't take into account the newest election, so those numbers are different. I should have updated that beforehand, but I forgot. But the Senate is still the same, except it's actually 19 Democrats. And then powers of all the General Assembly members. Everyone can write, introduce laws, they vote on legislations, and they all serve on committees. There's also boards, state agency boards that a lot of them serve on and provided guidance to, but for the sake of the General Assembly session is what we'll follow on. I think it's really important to underscore the need for advocacy from everyday Virginians. And what I'm about to talk about is just to provide some context. It's just illuminating that there is influence in the General Assembly related to money. This does not mean that every legislator is going to accept money and then be someone who's just going to follow everything that they say. But I do think it's important to illuminate how much money is involved in our campaign policies in Virginia. And I know plenty of people who take money from certain organizations and then voted against a bill that those companies or special interests were. So with that, we'll go ahead and swim it. So however, half of the General Assembly members accept 1/3 of their campaign contributions from private special interests. Again, this does not mean that just because they do that, they're going to vote a certain way, but we do understand that there are connections there that do exist that we can see, and that might influence their perspective. That's all I'm saying. And when we talk about environmental advocacy, Dominion Energy is listed as a top 10 donor for both political parties. It's not at the same level, and you can see all of these sources on the Virginia Public Access Project, where I got all of this data. And again, you can make the conclusions for yourself, but I don't want to say that there are people who are voting just because they received money for it. It's not the case, but it is helpful context. The next thing, and this is a bigger one, I think, is a perspective issue, or a perspective fact that I think people should be aware of. So the demographics, although this is actually one of the most diverse General Assemblies we've had, and we are going in the right direction, but only 42 out of 140 members are identify as women. So what does that mean in the grand scheme of things? That means that the majority of our legislators don't necessarily have the lived experience of what the unique struggles of people with these different identities. You also see there that 30 out of 140, and this also may have gone down or up in the last election, are people of color. So when it becomes issues that are directly related to these demographics, they don't necessarily can draw off of their experience. And we know for a fact that lived experience influences what bills will be introduced and by our General Assembly members, what the kind of passion they're going to bring to the issues and fighting for it, as well as the bills and potential legislation that they're going to support. So if they aren't in the room, where there's not a committee with the makeup that maybe represents your values or your lived experience, it's really beneficial for people who do have that type of experience to be there, to share their perspective, because otherwise it might not be there. Same thing goes for occupation. The majority of our lawmakers, about 50%, represent interests that aren't necessarily in the nonprofit sector, So for example, 50% are lawyers, what the VPAP lists as business people, as well as finance. And again, that's okay. These people can be influenced. That's the most important part about advocacy. But they might not necessarily have the perspective that we need them to have unless you're in the room sharing it with them. For example, when we talk about environmental advocacy, a lot of times it comes back to people's health. Polluting projects that destroy the planet are also destroying communities and livelihoods and health of different Virginians. So if we only have 7% of all of our legislators as medical professionals, they might not necessarily make that connection themselves. Same thing with community and nonprofit practitioners. Only 5% of them work in an area where it's where they're in the communities that you might be represented in. So if you're there sharing your perspective, it really goes a long way. Quickly, lawmaking process. Really quickly on the surface level, General Assembly member, House delegate, state senator, they have an idea about a law. They'll generally get that idea from an advocacy group, a lobbying organization, or, and this is really important, a constituent. I'm going to talk a little bit more about why that matters. After that, then they have the idea of a bill. Not all of them are lawyers. Not all of them are going to necessarily write in legalese necessary to be transferred into a bill. So they have to send it to the Division of Legislative Services. And when that happens, they take the bill, the idea for the bill, and they make sure that it's language that can be added to the Virginia Code, which just means the list of all the Virginia laws. And then when that happens, the legislator who introduced that original legislation, they become the chief patron. Bill is sent to committee. There's a difference between how the House does it versus the Senate. The Speaker of the House decides where a bill goes to what committee. And that's important because that's very much, the Speaker of the House is a political entity. There are people who've been, who are representatives of a party. So depending on what their perspective is, they might think a bill that should go in one committee actually goes to another one. In the Senate, it's done by the Senate clerk. So there's a little bit more of objectivity or objective view for it. So just again, one of those nuances that I think is important to know. The committees, when they review bills, hold public hearings. Now, obviously during the pandemic, a lot of them have been online, but here's what's important, especially if it's in person, anybody can go to those committee meetings. They're not closed off. As long as we can fit people in the room, they'll be in there to see it. During the committee, before they decide on what action they're going to take on a bill, they hear testimony, and then they vote on an action for the bill. There's a lot of different actions for the bill. We're going to talk about what they are, but for the most part, they just have one way that's the success. It's to report the bill. Bill has to pass both chambers. We don't necessarily have to get that, but once it passes the House or Senate, it goes to the opposite chamber. The whole committee process starts over again. And of course, as the last speaker just mentioned, goes to the governor's desk, and they can they can make changes, which is they cross part out and put something in. Which Virginia is one of the only states where you can do that. They can line item veto another change that can be made, and then or outright veto. Vetoes can be overruled by the General Assembly. They review vetoes in April. This goes on. But if it gets through all of this process, all the laws, unless otherwise stated, go into effect on July 1 of that year. So any laws passed in 2022, they'll go into effect generally in July 1st, 2022. Okay, now let's look at this from an advocacy perspective. You, as a constituent, can give an idea to a lawmaker. Not necessarily, you can go to your representative, have a meeting, say, I think this should be a law, and then they have that idea in there, and they can go to the Department of Legislative Services, even if they're not necessarily the facts, to make it a bill. There's a little known process, it's bill by request, and that's where a legislator carries a bill on behalf of one of their constituents. And then if that happens, especially, it's really vital to track legislation. What are the pressure points involved with important? Because you want to make sure that the committee is most favorable, because that's where most legislation lives and dies. That's where the decision is made in the committee process. Of course, you want to be able to attend those committees, whether it's virtual, if that's an option, and you want to speak at those committees. Really quickly on bill by requests. This is an example of one. 2017, dog tethering legislation is actually really big, but this is just an example. This legislator, and you can see this in the legislative information system, great tool to track legislation, has in parentheses by request. That means that the legislator wasn't necessarily the one who was part of their priorities to get this through, but they're doing it on behalf of a constituent. All right, once again, this is something I think you're all familiar with. Call, email your representatives once it goes before it gets to the floor. Track legislation to make sure you know exactly what's going on, and then repeat the committee tactics we just talked about. Even the governor, we can contact his constituent, their constituent services office, to make sure that there's public pressure to either veto a bill, change a bill, or sign a bill. Committees. This is, again, like I said, this is where the majority of the action happens during the General Assembly session. They're designated by topic. So the Education Committee will, generally speaking, get education bills. Most of them have subcommittees, especially in the House, which is like where the Education Committee, and then we'll have the Higher Education. That's a great way to think about it. Again, there's different ways that the committee process is done in the House versus the Senate, but for the most part, it's the same structure. It is also important that if it is a Senate subcommittee, they can only recommend action on a bill. So they can recommend to kill the bill, but they can't kill the bill. They can recommend passing the bill, but the bill doesn't have to be passed. It has to be passed by voters. So it's a bit of a Russian doll set situation with committees and subcommittees. In order for a bill to pass, one member has to say, I move we take this action. Another member has to second it, and then it goes to a vote. Quickly, and I mentioned this, and I won't go through every single one, but the highlight here is if something is reported, that means that it's going to go to the floor for a full vote. Sometimes it gets reported and gone to a different committee. So unless it's an outright report, that's the only time. That's the only success of a bill through a committee. Everything else, there's different names for them listed here, but they effectively kill the bill one way or another. Really quickly. Talk about where the bill is, LIS is the way to go. Now that said, if you want to find something by topic, probably the Virginia Public Access Project is your best bet. You can type, even have a search bar. I'm so sorry. I guess I dropped off for a second. Kyle, where did I drop?
The last I heard was you were talking about the bill process, and you had the Schoolhouse Rock bill slide up.
Okay, so this one.
Perfect. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I was just mentioning how to track a bill, Legislative Information Service, our Legislative Information System, LAS.gov or .va.gov. Really interesting, a really good one. If you want to track legislation close to real time, that's the one to use it. If you want to search a bill by a topic, the best one I think to use is the Virginia Public Access Project. If there's a search bar in it, you want to type in clean energy, pollution, etc. They'll pull up all the bills during that session that relate to that topic. So those are great tools to use to make sure you, as everyday Virginians who want to make sure they're advocating the right way, I recommend those ones. Of course, there's a quick method, and we're going to go through slides of this, so we'll just go for it now. So you can see here, an example, 2020 session. This is one of the first. This is the first page you'll see on LIS, you can the first thing you can press is bills and resolutions. Bills and resolutions, that's how you can find all of the ones. You can track it by member, you can track it by bill number, you can track it by different ways, or what committee it's in. That's great. Let's just pull up a particular bill. So in 2020, this was the first bill that was introduced by the House. FTT, excuse voting. You can see that was before this was introduced and was waiting for a committee referral before the General Assembly session had even started. So history, that's how you check the progress of a bill. When I made this slide back then, of course, we were waiting for a committee referral pending. But check it every day, because it might say, now this bill is going to the Privileges and Elections Committee. We'll look at the same bill from the file from the previous year, and we can see the entire history of it and what the fate of the bill was. There it is. Pre-filed, it was referred to Committee on Privileges and Elections. Assigned to a subcommittee, and then you can see in the House, subcommittee recommends laying on the table. Since it wasn't report, we know that that killed the bill. And then you see House left in Privileges and Elections. That's how you track legislation. You'll be able to see it. If had this gone further, it would have said passed by this committee, going to floor vote. Floor vote now goes to the Senate. Senate refers to etc. committee. Okay, so really important point too. You can also see what members voted for and voted against the bill by clicking on the link about subcommittee or also the committee. Once they take an action, we can see, it's part of the transparency, exactly how the legislators voted on a particular bill. So in terms of accountability, in terms of holding our legislators' feet to the fire, this is one of the best ways to be able to make sure that we know exactly what actions they took and what support. That can be helpful because that means that we can try to influence in the later years, or try to make sure that if it goes to a full committee, to lobby those people who had concerns about it and try to sway them into voting in favor of it or against it. Quickly on lobbying. So lobbying is big, especially when it comes to constituent lobbying. The best way to think about it is not to have some veil of importance of everything. Our legislators serve 45-day, 60-day terms during the legislative session. They're going to hear from hundreds of people. So when you're lobbying with them, that is your moment to leave an impression. It is your moment to say, when I leave this meeting, they're going to remember what facts we gave them and how I feel about it. And being able to do that is, well, the benefit of it is indescribable, because if you leave a major impression, they're going to go into the floor, or they're going to go into the rest of the session remembering what you said, remembering how you felt, so that they know they can feel some sense of conviction when they're making a vote on it. Again, that's just the basic way. I think people get a lot of times nervous talking to these folks, but I would say, these are just normal everyday people like you and I. They might be in an elected position, but they have to look at thousands of bills, or they might have to review hundreds of bills, and thousands of bills with the General Assembly. So if we leave an impression, that's how we know, especially if it's not a bill that gets a lot of media attention, that's how we can make a difference. Quick dues, if you're a constituent, make sure that you highlight that. If you have connections to your community, make sure you talk about them. Triste already mentioned this, bring a handout, especially if you want to leave an impression. They might be like, well, this person I spoke to was really good, but I'm not sure I know all of the facts about it, all of the around it. So if they have a handout to reference it. And by the way, you'll hear all the time when they're deliberating on the House floor, I spoke to this constituent who told me why this bill is important. I spoke to a constituent who told me that this bill is directly related to their health and livelihood. And they'll tell your story. That's what the best ones is. And if you have a handout to make sure that they have all the facts straight, it's great. That way they can reference it, not just from a personal angle, but also from a more fact-based angle. This one's huge. Tell personal stories. If you have a direct connection with the bill that you're lobbying for, then it will be a lot more impactful than if you just talk about it academically. Remember, we have great organizations like VCN or the Sierra Club, then professional lobbyists who do this full-time, who are paid to do this full-time. We're paid to do it so that we know all the research angles from these things, and we can tell our legislators from the professional viewpoint. You're there to humanize the issue. You're there to make sure that they know how much it means to you, their constituent. And if you can tell a personal story, that is one of the most impactful things that happens in the General Assembly. And the last thing is, give them a hard ask and try to get a hard answer. The legislators can be really good at being dodgy, depending on it, but try not to leave the office with saying, well, how do you feel? Are you with us on this? Are you against us on this? Do you have concerns? Try to understand, especially if you're doing a lobby day with an organization, exactly how they're going to feel about a vote or a bill, so that we can come back and say, okay, well, this person has concerns, and now let's work on them a little bit more. And the last thing is related to personal stories. Don't just talk about these things through an abstract view. If you care about it, tell them why you care about it. If it's because you're worried about your children or grandchildren's future, tell them that. Because that's something that they would feel bad about voting against. Well, I had the power to do something to ensure security for these people or this community, and I didn't do it. And again, we can loop that back, and that's how we hold legislators accountable. Biggest thing is, and one of the things that I learned really quickly, don't view our legislators as celebrities. We have a part-time legislature. They're not doing this full-time. They're not constantly busy moving through things. It's really busy during the General Assembly session, sure, but these people are members of their community just like you and I. So the worst thing you can do is think, oh, there must be something really special about this person because they were elected to this office. Maybe, but not necessarily. And that's okay. It's great to think that we can have everyday people be in positions of decision-making, but don't view them as something really special, because then you might get nervous about it or think that they know everything about it already, or that you're being repetitive. You're not. You have every right to be there to make sure that you're making a difference. And they, as public service individuals, should be there to listen. Debating, it never works out. If they say something that pisses you off and you try to challenge that, that's the impression you're going to make. This person was rude to me. If they say something that is problematic, it's okay to correct them in a polite, civil way. But if you start trying to say, well, no, let's get into a back and forth about this, it hurts your lobbying efforts. Even if it's something you have a strong disagreement with, just always try to bring it back to what you think. Well, I don't necessarily know about that, delegate, whoever, but I do think of it this way. And that's the way to have a smooth meeting, because again, you want to leave a transition. You want to leave an impression, excuse me. Straying from the point, especially in the issues we're involved in, there's so much going on, but you got to stay narrow-minded about what it is, because if you're presenting all these different issues, then the impression you're leaving is nothing that's going to be some concrete enough for them to remember. Only bring up facts and figures and studies. We talked about why this is important. That should be on your handout. You are complementary to the handout. You are humanizing the handout. So bringing up facts and studies, etc. One, they can always find another study that says something else. And two, they're not gonna, they'll already have it. What's the point of you being there if the handout already has these things there? So quickly engaging committees. Excuse me, trying to make sure this works. Committees are where most of the action happens in the General Assembly session. This is where a lot of the make and break moments take place. There's advantages to committees. There's less members to convince, so it's a little bit easier to get our message out there. The media is present, and this is a big one, and anyone can speak. I've seen people come from out of state who aren't even Virginians, who are experts on something, testify. I've seen people who had to take off work, which is a problem in itself, who had to take out work and find childcare so that they could testify about a bill that was directly related to their life. If you're there, the committee chairman at one point will say, is there anyone in the audience who is in favor of this bill who wishes to speak? And you can do it. Same thing for opposition. Is there anyone in the audience who is opposed to this bill who would like to speak? That is something that is really powerful. As I mentioned before, the media is present, and the media is looking for that personal angle. Every reporter I talk to as the comms person says, yeah, I kind of already know the background of the issue. Do you know of anyone who can actually speak to this as a point of their own lives? And when they have that, it'll be great. And so that's great for their piece. So these two things combined, I've seen happen. There's been times when, well, in my last job, I worked on higher education legislation, and there was a bill that was problematic for financial aid. It could have reduced financial aid in Virginia to Virginians by $100 million. And we found a student who was on financial aid to speak to a group, and we heard everything from our lobbying tracking that this bill was going to pass. And this young woman spoke for maybe, for, I don't know, not even 2 minutes. And all she said was, you know, I have dreams to be one of you. I want to be someone who can help my community have a better outcome. I want to be someone who can make a decision maker, can make a difference in my state, in my community. But if I can't do that without the financial aid that you're about to take away. So she didn't even say, please vote against this bill. All she said was, don't limit my dreams. And the media was there, and they knew that if they had just that they're gonna record that woman's story if they vote against it, and if they vote in favor of it, excuse me. And so that committee was actually said, we don't want to take an issue on it. We're going to pass it to another committee, because they felt so bad about it. And then by then, the following week, we were able to get 80 students there to oppose that bill. And the original patron kind of read the tea leaves and pulled it, and struck it from the record so that it could not be voted on. That's kind of thing happens all the time in the General Assembly session. And that was years ago when the power structure was completely different. So just don't underestimate the power of your voices, or anyone's voice for that matter, because it really can make a difference. Testifying tips. It's always a little nerve-wracking to be able to do it, especially since it's like you go to a podium and they're literally elevated looking down on you, which they're supposed to be public service people. So I don't know, it just feels wrong. Nonetheless, I digress. You just quickly say where you're from, especially if one of the legislators is your direct representative. Speak about the personal impact. Once again, facts and figures. Most groups will already take care of that. But talk about how that bill could directly help or hurt you. And then keep your remarks brief. 1 minute, they usually allow maybe 1 or 2 minutes for each person. Sometimes they have like a 10-minute total for each person to speak. There might be other people who also have a good story to tell. We want to get as many of those as possible. Because again, this is one of the times we can hold them accountable. If you vote for this bill, you're hurting me. If you vote for this bill, you can make my life better. Get that narrative out there so that they have to feel bad for going against you. And then of course, after you do that, thank the chair, thank the committee, and you're done. You never know what that outcome will be. There was a woman who spoke about Medicaid expansion in 2019, 2018. And she had a testimony where she even started as, I'm a little nervous, but I'm here because my son lost his health insurance, but because he makes too much money to qualify for Medicaid, but not enough to qualify for Obamacare, he's in this gap. And my husband and I, who've worked hard all our lives, will bankrupt ourselves to take care of our child. He has a heart condition. And his medicine costs $10,000 every year or every month if we don't have health insurance. Please, please vote for Medicaid expansion. They still did not vote for Medicaid expansion. That bill was actually passed later on in the session. It did end up passing, but that woman was on the front page of the Richmond Times the Richmond Times Dispatch the next morning. And again, the article was, a rebuke to this concerned mother, so it made him look bad. And then later on, like I said, that bill did end up passing. There's a lot of efforts of why that was the case, but that testimony made a difference. I'm almost done. Certainly want to be respectful of everybody's time. Just quickly, we're in a budget year. The Virginia budget process is a little different than everything I was talking about. I'll do a quick overview. We pass a budget every other year, even years. The budget gets kind of a tune-up in odd years. It's the reason that in even years, General Assembly session is 60 days, odd years it's only 45 days. They do something called a biennium. This means that that's the 2 years in which that budget is in effect, funds get distributed. And it's all involves and surrounds the money committees. The money committees is either the Appropriations Committee in the House, Finance Committee in the Senate. The process is kind of wild because the budget, the governor will introduce a budget, which is rarely ever passed because the money committee won't have their hands on it. And remember this, budgets are a reflection of priority. So when we pass a budget that includes funding for conservation, that means that our state is prioritizing conservation. So what happens is Appropriations Committee, Finance Committee, they make their own budgets. It goes to their respective changers. They'll sometimes pass it, they won't. Then it gets flipped to the other chamber and it is immediately rejected so that they can force them to work together. Is this process maybe kind of a waste of time? I don't know. It is certainly something where it seems like they can work out their differences but we don't have a system that sets up like that. So once other chambers reject it, both the members of the Senate and the House money committees work out the differences. So the final product is vastly different from the governor's budget, from the House's budget, and the Senate's budget. Once again, these are very powerful players when it comes to providing resources. This is one of the things that we can do to make a lot of difference. So any advocacy effort should usually think about making sure that there's a huge focus on committee members of the money committee and the subcommittee members of the money committee. Because, like I said, budgets are a reflection of priority. It's literally about putting money where its mouth is. So if you can make an advocacy effort on these things, it makes a huge difference. So I was trying to get through that in the time allotted to me. I think I maybe went a little over, but I'm here for questions and answers. I don't know if I saw there's a couple in the chat. Kyle, should I answer those now or should I wait till later?
You can answer them now.
Okay, great. So let's see. Bills. I see one says about bills are killed. Well, yeah, we'll go by this really quickly. As I mentioned, report, that's the only one. If you see report, that means the bill is a success. If you see report and refer, that's not a success. The only outright success to go to a House floor vote is report. There's different terms that they use to kill a bill that are nicer ways to kill it, I guess, but effectively it's all the same. Pass by indefinitely, that means that it kills the bill because we're not going to deal with this. We're just going to pass it by and just leave it there. So it never gets a chance to speak. It never gets a chance to get voted on. Oh, and by the way, all the chairmen of the committees, they get to decide when a bill is up for review. So if a chairman sees a bill and says, I don't like it, they can just hold off on it. And that's another way to kill the bill. Pass by for the day. that generally means the bill is considered at the next committee meeting. And again, we've seen this happen with legislation before where they just keep passing it by for the day until something called crossover. That's when all the bills in one chamber have to be passed before they can be considered in the other chamber. If it's not passed by the crossover day, the bill's dead. Next one, strike, usually at the behest of the original patron, the chief patron, as we talked about. That means they don't even want it to be considered, just get rid of it. So they could introduce something. It might be problematic for different advocacy groups and say, oh, well, you know what, this was well intentioned, but it's not a good idea actually after reflecting on it. So let's not even worry about it. That's what strike is. Refer, mention that. I think it's pretty straightforward. Lay on the table. Technically, that means they could vote to consider it later on, but it's 99% of the time it's used to kill a bill. Sometimes they'll say something, we'll gently lay it on the table, which is a nicer way of saying, we really don't want it, we don't really care about this, so let's kill it. Incorporate, this happens quite often. That means that this bill is kind of similar to another bill or exactly the same as another bill, so let's just mash them together. That's what incorporate means. John said, I have a new delegate. When are they sworn in? They'll be sworn in January. I don't know the exact date. But the legislative session starts always on the second Wednesday of January. We have like a late session this time. So they'll be sworn in before that. How it's decided whether a bill starts in the Senate or House. Sure, I'll bring this back up again. So whether a bill starts in the Senate or House, it depends on who introduces it. So if I'm a state senator, I want to introduce a bill, it starts in the Senate. If I'm a delegate, I want to introduce a bill, it will start in the House. Sometimes you'll see that the same bill is introduced by both chambers. So it's the same language. Actually, the Virginia Clean Economy Act had one of these, was one of the most significant pieces of environmental legislation we've passed over the last 2 years. We had a Senate version and a House version. There's advantages and disadvantages to doing that, but it's a great way to see how, especially in a divided party structure like we're about to have in Virginia, with Republicans controlling the House and Democrats controlling the Senate, to see how the bill is going to be reviewed in one chamber. So we might see it fails in one chamber but passes the other. That means we have more time to work on the people who had concerns over it later on. So all these are great questions. What are the dates of this year's GA? I mentioned that. Sorry, it's second Wednesday of January. I'm terrible with calendar memory, so I don't know exactly what that date is, but it'll be there. We don't yet know. I think it's DLS will release a legislative calendar. They haven't done the session calendar, at least last one I checked 2 days ago. But you can usually look it up, General Assembly calendar dates. It'll show you all the important ones. Whether it's, this is to the day when bills can be introduced, to this is crossover, to what they call sine die, which just means the close of the General Assembly session. We often lobby prior to the GA based on what committee or bills normally go to, but this is determined by the speaker. Yes. Is there a framework for what topics go to what committees that has to be followed, or is there a way to fight what committee a bill goes to? Yes and no. So it really depends, and we're gonna have a new speaker too in the House of Delegates most likely. So we'll see what kind of logic there is for what committee referrals get to. I'm gonna be honest with you, that sometimes there is political games. For example, a few years ago, the Speaker of the House kept sending particular progressive legislation to what was called the Rules Committee. Didn't seem like it belonged there, but they sent it there anyway because there was more of the party in control members and less of the party not in control members, whereas before that they had like more of an equal structure on other committees. So it was politically advantageous to send that legislation to somewhere they knew it would die. Things happen. Again, this comes back to pressure. What are the pressure points? Look, the Speaker of the House, that's a really important responsibility. They're supposed to represent every single Virginian. So make your voices heard now. That's not something where we can say, well, it's not my constituents. No, because their power actually affects all of us. And this is true actually for every legislator, but especially the ones who are in leadership. So public pressure is sometimes the only way we can ensure that things the bills go to where they're supposed to go to. Whether or not different speakers or different people in power will listen to public pressure, I mean, I don't know. But at least we know that we did everything we could to make sure that they were doing the right thing. That's the point. Even if we fail, at least we tried. And you never know how much those efforts are going to yield dividends in the future. can a bill ever be killed for all subsequent legislative sessions, or are bills killed just for the session? Just for the session at hand. I don't think they could pass a bill, for example, that says we can never consider another bill. I think that would be unconstitutional, just by Virginia's constitution. But that's a good question, and I'm sure if there was a way for them to do it, they could. We didn't get into like what amendments to the Constitution would be. That's a very arduous process. I can talk about it in person. I can talk about it a little bit more if people are interested. But that one takes a little bit longer because you have to vote. It has to pass the General Assembly, and then you have to wait for a General Assembly election, and it has to pass again. And then it goes to all Virginians on a referendum at the subsequent election. That's one of those complicated things, but I'm not aware of any big pushes for the Constitution at this point. But so to answer your question, no, it's just for the session at hand. Is the plan for the session to be 100% in person? I'm hearing different things. Our legislative director, who is on vacation, well-deserved vacation before we have to get into it, are different. I don't want to speculate. So I have heard that it could be somewhat in person, with mask policies, and somewhat digital. I hope, and this is something that the public can do in terms of pressuring the leadership, that there are the inclusion of more equitable ways for people's voices to be heard. I mentioned this earlier. So Richmond, this all takes place in Richmond for the General Assembly session. Imagine if you're a person who's 4 hours away in the southwest corner of Virginia. And imagine if you're a person who works a wage job, who has kids. The amount of steps you have to go through just to make your voice heard. And by the way, sometimes they'll get there and there'll be too many people in the room and they won't be allowed to come in. Or other people took up too much time speaking, so there was no more time for them to speak. All of that, this happens. And it's really sad that people go really far from where they were supposed to because their story was impactful and they weren't allowed to speak. That's a missed opportunity, not just for our legislators, but for all of us. When one of us can't speak, we don't have the full perspective of what people need in Virginia. And if we don't have that, then we're not operating in a way that's of good faith to everybody who has the biggest concerns. The people with the least amount of power will always be overlooked as long as we have a structure that is inequitable. And that's just the truth. So I hope we proved last session that we can rely on digital engagement. We proved that it's possible for people to testify over Zoom. And I am hopeful, and maybe it won't be this session, but at some point we're going to make it sure that you don't have to lose wages, find childcare, pay for a bunch of gas, and maybe find lodging when you don't have a lot in the first place, just to make sure that your perspective might be considered during the legislative session. Because it's not fair. It's not fair to those people. And oftentimes those are the people who are most impacted by a lot of the legislation that you're going to talk about throughout the rest of this training. That's all the questions I see.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Tim. Great as usual, honestly.
Thanks.
As a reminder, y'all can post your questions in the Q&A section. If you have more questions for Tim, I'll make sure he gets them. You can either send it to him or you can order send to me. But without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Wyatt Gordon.
Hey everyone, I'm Wyatt Gordon. I'm the Land Use and Transportation Policy Manager with VCN. I'm going to be giving you a much quicker rundown of just how the VCN legislative process works. First off, kudos to Tim, because breaking down the General Assembly and how to navigate it is something that is not easy, generally not interesting. So thanks for doing that hard job. Okay, so VCN. As you all know, we are a group of over 150 different organizations from all across the Commonwealth. We stretch from everything to your local bike group, to the garden club, to some of our bigger green members like League of Conservation Voters, Sierra Club, for example. One of our functions is really to kind of serve as a constant legislative presence for groups that can't be here in Richmond in person because y'all are doing work all across the state, and Virginia doesn't always seem like a big state, but it can be hours from end to end, and it's just not feasible to come here and testify. So that's kind of what we do specifically in January. I'll start us off at the beginning of the year. We are there in person for you, having meetings with legislators. We're advocating on behalf of the policies that we've compiled together to represent the entire coalition. We're working with some of our in-district advocacy teams to coordinate our messaging and how we're communicating with strategic lawmakers. This is something that's going to be incredibly important as we go forward. We all know that some of the shifting politics in Richmond have made it really important to shore up what we're doing with specific legislators and keep them in line with the environmental priorities that we've worked so hard over the past few years to get passed. We're also a watchdog for a lot of regulatory and policy issues. There are meetings going on here from whether it's the SEC or the Commonwealth Transportation Board. We're watching those and distributing the information to y'all. So that's just what we're generally doing. All throughout January through March, we're pretty much spending our time on the Hill here in Richmond, talking with lawmakers, talking with constituents, advocating, coordinating, convening. What happens at the end of the session? Sometimes we have a lot of victories, sometimes we have some nice defensive wins. And then what we generally move into after that, starting in March and April, we shift into doing our listening sessions. This is something we've been doing for a few years. It's traditionally been in person. Clearly for the last couple of years, nothing has been in person. We are looking forward to getting more in-person events happening. So I think you'll see starting probably early next April, we will have VCN teams coming out and visiting different regions. It's probably one of our favorite things to do is to get out and meet all of our partners who we've been working with all year, but haven't had a chance to see face to face. Especially the opportunities where we get to see their work in person, whether it's just a tree planting with Friends of the Rappahannock or any other types of like a trail walk down in Southwest Virginia. It's really wonderful to see what the policy that we work on all year actually produces for communities and real tangible benefits and upgrades people's health and quality of life. So we're really excited to get back to those. After that, we shift from regional meetings where we're really trying to listen and hear what the issues are across the Commonwealth. We shift towards work group meetings. VCN has, I believe, 4 work groups. We have land use and transportation, which I chair, land and water, which my colleague Pat Calvert chairs, and then we have energy, which my colleague Narissa chairs. You'll also see that we cover a fair number of other issues, whether it's good government or education, environmental justice. Those we don't have specific working groups for. We have kind of smaller groups and calls that we manage those through and stay abreast of what's going on. But in late April, we bring together our work groups, traditionally in person. It's sometimes the one point of the year that everyone working on the same bucket of issues gets to see each other. So we'll have to see how those go. I think we'll probably be exploring how we can do hybrid meetings for those. We can both have people in person to kind of build that community, but also allow folks to still be involved virtually, because we've seen how valuable that is, that people don't have to disrupt their whole lives and come to the Capitol to really have their voice heard, whether that's at the Capitol with lawmakers or just within our network itself. So all of the working group meetings, all of that is designed to kind of build a consensus around what we want to advocate for in our common agenda, which I can drop a link to. All of y'all know this is our briefing book. I like to call it our big book of demands. Increasingly over the past years, we've seen legislators take ideas straight out of what we're doing and turn them into laws. So it's a really important document for all of our work, and just to make sure that we're communicating and building consensus there. So that's kind of what we spend all of May, June, July. We're doing multiple reviews and edits, getting everyone's feedback, allowing people to suggest policy changes, we're hammering out disagreements within our network internally. We're doing an equity review, making sure that all of our policies aren't disproportionately impacting any groups. And if anything, we're really trying to help lift up some groups that have been marginalized. So all of that ends in our big celebration, which has traditionally been around summertime. I would say early August is what we've been hitting recently when we launch our common agenda. So you see the physical books, but it's all online via the link that I just dropped in the chat. And that has every single policy that we are actively advocating for. And it crosses everything from wildlife corridors to how we're handling mussels to bike infrastructure, green jobs for solar energy. There's everything in there. Then in October, we bring everyone together and we do a big annual meeting. This is kind of the first step as we get folks organized towards the next round of General Assembly in the following January. So we're doing a lot of advocacy work throughout the fall. That's writing op-eds, that's reaching out to lawmakers, that's trying to get our bills placed and carried. And all of that kind of culminates with the General Assembly preview in December, where we bring all of our network partners together and we say, hey, based on what we've been doing together since the end of the last General Assembly, this is what we see shifting, moving. This is kind of what we think is going to happen with the General Assembly. And these are the places that you either need to watch out because something bad is coming, or really give like a nice final push because we think we can get this big policy over the finish line. Trying to think, I think I'll just say as we move into the next General Assembly, we have regular updates via our listservs. So you can get a nice comms update from Nicole each week once we're in session. She'll let you know every bill that is moving forward, every bill that is dying, every opportunity to get involved. We also have that available for folks somewhat via our bill tracker. So you can kind of go in there directly, see where all of the bills we're watching and monitoring are. So if you have a bill, you can watch it move through, or if you have a bill that you hate, you can watch it go as we try and kill it at each step of the way. But yeah, I'm happy to try and answer any questions in case there's anything I missed, or if you guys just have things that you want to know that I didn't touch on. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. Does anyone have one? If not, then I will pass it back to Kyle.
And that's what I'm saying. If no one has any questions, if you come up with questions later, like I said, I will make sure it gets to the correct person. But if there's no questions, Wyatt, thank you again for doing this with us. But I can transition to our outro, and you guys are going to have an extra 30 minutes of your time. So thank you again, Wyatt. Thank you, Trius. Thank you, Tim. And thank you, Lisa, behind the scenes. So next up for the trail guide, the General Assembly Trail Guide, we will be having our General Assembly preview December 3rd from 9:30 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. So that's December 3rd, and that's the General Assembly preview. So leading Virginia conservation experts will give presentations on the environmental topics that we can expect will rise to the top during the 2022 General Assembly session. You'll leave with the tools necessary to educate your legislative representatives about advancing these conservation policies. Attendees will have the opportunity to ask questions at the conclusion of each panel and to participate in a regional breakout discussion. So that is December 3rd. That is from 9:30 a.m. to 12 p.m. That is our General Assembly preview. Signups are still open. After that, we'll be having our mock lobby day practice sessions, or known as office hours. That is December 6th to December 10th, that entire week, and that will be at lunchtime. And so they're an hour. And those are still open to sign up. If you sign up for those, you'll work with a guest educator who has experience in the GA, and you'll run through small group practice sessions as you practice pitching your conservation policies of choice and get tips and tricks to make the most of your time lobbying for your conservation issues. So once again, the General Assembly preview, December 3rd, and then the office hours, aka mock lobby day practice sessions, will be held the 6th through the 10th at lunchtime. And signups are still open for all of those, so feel free to sign up. And once again, if you have any more questions for our educators, or if you have any questions about the trail guide to the General Assembly, please feel free to email me or the appropriate person with those questions, and we'll make sure they can answer. But with that, please have a great rest of your day, and maybe a great rest of your lunch. It's a beautiful Friday. It's a little cold up here, but why don't you go ahead and get out of here. Have a great rest of your day and weekend. Bye.